So we, as you know, begin in silence because it's our way of expressing our intention to be here. And it's also our way of affirming that we live inside the Sacred Heart of God and that God seeks to find aliveness and expression through how we live in the world. So let's take a moment of silence. And may grace be in our heads and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our hearing. May grace be in my mouth and in my speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be in our ends and in our departing. And may, because of what we do here today, we grow in patience, tolerance, kindness, and love, and all creation benefit from what we do here. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your spiritual journey, you are celebrated here. Dr. McDonald just did this, but I would add one thing to this. This is Christmas time. So families have relatives coming in from all over, grandparents, aunts, uncles, nieces, all that sort of thing. And if you want to have a big crowd at a church service, involve the children, right? So the parents will come, and now the grandparents are here, and aunts and uncles will be here. So the reason now that we have pre-service music at 4 o'clock is because people come at 4 o'clock in order to be here by 4:30. So I'll be here at 4 o'clock today, and I encourage you to be, because it is a service not to be missed. It is such fun. So, and then on Christmas Eve, services at noon, 4, 6, 8, a lot of church. Next Sunday, we will not meet here. There will be one worship service next Sunday, and that will be at 10 o'clock. So that should get us covered. You okay with that? Okay. It's a great time. And thank goodness for cooler weather. You're grateful? Okay. So here we go. Kind of a continuation of this theme of walking the way. It isn't the way because Jesus walked it. Jesus walked it because it's the way. And I am seeking and then sharing with you what it might mean in this time for us to walk a way that Jesus exemplified. To embrace the way because Jesus walked it is to embrace the way of explanation. A person is given or inherits a way and then develops an ability to explain and defend this approach as the way. And this is how we all start off. We embrace an identity given to us by our tribes. Tribal identity is essential because that's what we need to survive the first half of life. But the task of the second half of life are hopefully different. They're to move us beyond the path of explanation and into the second part of Sarah Grant's line. Jesus walked it because it's the way, and that is the way of exploration. So in the second half of life, we should begin to experience for ourselves the meaning of that second part of that phrase. Now, before going any further today, I'm going to play for you a video. We'll probably need the lights turned out for this. Have you stood in front of a fire hose ever? That's what you're about to do. So the video has some audio with it, and it has some instructions, and I just want you to watch the whole thing, and then we'll talk about it. Here goes.
The monkey business illusion. count how many times the players wearing white passed the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
How many of you have seen that before? Something like it. How many of you saw the gorilla first time? I won't ask how many didn't. The first time that I saw it, I didn't see the gorilla. And the guy who showed it to me played it again, and I said, that's a different video. The most important task, it seems to me, for mature religion is to teach us how to see, not what to see. This is why I call last week's teaching Unlearning and Unknowing. And since we spent a fair amount of time on the topic of unlearning last week, I'm not going to repeat that except to say that what we initially learn from our tribe is very likely very, very useful. It keeps us alive. It gives us an identity. It helps us know the rules by which to play. It's like, and this is my most used illustration of this, it's like a piano teacher giving a piano student etudes to study, to play. But if the student never moves beyond etudes, they never learn to play the piano. So there's importance about learning the rules of things, and then there's importance about learning how to move beyond those. I personally grew up in a religious tradition that told me that for my eternal well-being, I needed to accept Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. As soon as I had reached the age of accountability, which in the Baptist denomination that I grew up in meant when I was old enough to hold my breath long enough to get ducked underneath the water, then I could be coming out of that water and I would be a transformed person that you see in front of you today. I mean, seriously, even after that, and for years, I felt like because of the teaching of my church, and again, I love those people and they meant well and everything, but all the time I felt like I had one foot in hell and the other on a banana peel. And then I began to actually read and study the teachings of Jesus. Not as my tribe taught, but in a wider circle of scholarship. And I discovered that there is no place in the Bible where Jesus says, believe in me. Some people said that about him, but Jesus himself never said anything like that. What Jesus did say that shaped the early teaching career that I had was a question that he put to his disciples one day. Who do you say that I am? Boy, I've spent a lot of time on that, and we'll spend some time today and in the coming year. Who is Jesus? How do we know? How do we know what he said? But the other thing is the corollary to that, and that is, who is the you who answers that question? And for years, that was the focus of my study. So I wanted to gain as much clarity as possible about personal identity, personal growth. How do we grow psychologically and spiritually? I think one of the primary reasons we are on this planet is to grow. I knew that there were untold numbers of people like me who had, to one degree or another, been disillusioned by the religion they'd received in their youth. Some had been quite frightfully religiously and spiritually abused, some physically abused. And I wanted to speak to that population. I wanted to speak to the population that said, I am spiritual but not religious. Even to this day, when people find out that I'm connected to the church, I'll get this kind of guilty response. Well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Or I don't go into church anymore. And I've come to think that's really kind of weird response, because if you said to somebody, well, I'm into sales, you wouldn't expect somebody to say, well, I don't buy anything.
Not do that.
Or if somebody says, what do you do? I build buildings. Well, I don't go into buildings myself, but I know people who do. By the way, if you had asked Jesus if he was religious, I doubt he would have understood the question. If he did, it would have nothing to do with going to the synagogue on the Sabbath. As a matter of fact, one of the things that led to his execution was his flagrant violation of Sabbath regulations. So I understand why people want nothing to do with the church. As a matter of fact, I have difficulty with it myself. I do not want to be associated with what has become the public face of Christianity in the United States. So many people who call themselves Christian are clearly racist, aggressive, hostile, closed-minded, incredibly insensitive toward anyone who disagrees with them. Now, I wrote that line, and then I thought, maybe that's wrong. Maybe they are incredibly very sensitive. You should see some of the emails I get.
That's good.
Or maybe you shouldn't.
You bet that.
So I'm going to play another clip for you. So could we have the lights out one more time? This is the reason that I will never be senior pastor of any church, what you're about to see. And I don't want to be either.
Something I get the most often even is people like to tell me that I look a little bit like a chocolate Jesus. If I'm being completely honest, I don't even like this joke anymore. I'm just not successful enough to stop doing it in that situation. Also, isn't it more like historically accurate Jesus, though? I don't even mind. I just love the idea of millions of conservative Christians going to church every Sunday to pray to a brown socialist Jew from the Middle East. With a Mexican name? This makes complete sense. This is why the world is so messed up. Jesus has probably already come back. Jesus just couldn't get through immigration. This man is stuck applying for a visa for carpentry. It's embarrassing. But people forget sometimes, though, so just to remind them, if I'm bored on a Sunday morning, I'll just put on my favorite robe and just go down to my local church like, guess who's back?
We have a moral obligation to be happy. I love that sort of stuff.
Bill, who's still in?
I have no idea. I'll send it to you if you like.
Did I please? No, I think that was that here.
You can probably look it up. And I'll send it to you. I'll put the links to both of those. The files are too big to put on the website. The MP4 files are too big. So I'll send a link when I send the summary out if you don't get it. The irony to me about people taking offense at what I or someone like me teaches about the Bible is that I'm not making this stuff up. I'm using some of the smartest, best scholarship available in theological circles today to teach what I teach. And yet the people who are upset about this way of understanding the Bible will turn around and use the Bible to give authority to their latest prejudice. There's something terribly wrong when so-called Christian orthodoxy, which has been responsible in so much of the world for so much horror perpetrated in the name of Jesus, preaches in this country a Jesus who is silent about racism, a Jesus who is silent about negative attitudes about women, the way women are excluded, is silent about judgment that is passed on individuals who don't fit evangelical requirements for accepted sexual orientation and practices. So if you want to hold it that you are spiritual but not religious, I get that. I don't blame you. It is not only understandable, it's just fine. I was thinking this morning of being in a conversation where somebody asked Matt Russell what he did, and he said, I do church for people who hate church. However, there's that delicious theological word again. However, if you and I are in a personal conversation and you say to me that you are religious, that you are spiritual but not religious, be prepared. Because I'm going to ask you, how does that spirituality take shape and show itself? You don't attend church services. Got it. Fine. I understand that. But what do you do? My current spiritual practice takes me over an hour a day. Now, I don't have young children at home. I'm pretty much self-employed. I set my own schedule. Many of you do not have that luxury. However, and you know I love you, and you know I'm not meaning to be judgmental, but if you don't have a spiritual practice that lasts over 15 minutes a day, you don't have one. You could give yourself one for Christmas. Now, I will be clear, you don't have to have one. You don't. But as my dentist says, you only have to floss the teeth you want to keep. If you want to make progress, and that's a terrible thing to say about spiritual work because it ends up trying to evaluate and measure, but if you want to move on the way that Meister Eckhart calls the wayless way, you cannot do it without a spiritual practice. So the first major roadblock on the way to that wayless way is having a spiritual practice. I'm going to mention 3 major roadblocks on the way for you to contemplate over the holidays. This is the first one, having a spiritual practice. Having a spiritual practice is difficult. It is inconvenient. It is disappointing. At times it is humiliating because in our culture we are taught that we need to succeed at things, and you cannot be a success at having a spiritual practice. You simply have one. If you apply the word success to it, you fail before you started. You just do it. And you do it so long and so habitually that when you don't do it, it feels uncomfortable to you. It feels like you haven't taken a bath that day. The second roadblock, and we talked about this a little bit last week, is unlearning. Now, we're going to have a lot of things to unlearn. And I want to be clear again that in this teaching of the wayless way, I'm not debunking Jesus. I'm not debunking the Bible. I'm not debunking the church. I'm raising questions. I wholeheartedly embrace, and I encourage you to embrace, the teaching of the Buddha, who is alleged to have said, don't believe anything just because I say it. Go check it out for yourself. There are resources out there available. This stuff that I've been teaching about, the nativity stories, one of the most accessible things is the Board Crossing book. It's very readable. Check it out. And the footnotes. Don't take something just because any teacher says, it's in the Bible, or I said it. If it resonates with you, then that's something to pay attention to. I think one of the reasons that I likely mentioned so many books, and I was going to try to make it through today without doing one, but I've already done one, and not my notes. But I want to give credit to my teachers, both living and dead, who have enriched my life, and also to let you know that I'm not making this stuff up. There is academic research and documentation behind everything I say, except the puns. And those I can't help. You know, a thing that's mildly terrifying to me is that we seem in this culture to be moving into an era of anti-scientism. First, it was the nonsense about alternative facts, and now some people are saying that science is simply not to be trusted. So if I say, well, biblical archaeology shows, somebody now can say, well, I just don't believe that. And there's no argument for that. I don't know where you go with that. The third block I want to mention today, and as I said, there are many, are the one, and we will encounter them over and over and over again, is the roadblock of unknowing. You should be able to complete the sentence. Jesus was a Jewish mystic in the prophetic tradition. Okay. That's key to understanding Jesus.
Yeah.
The key to understanding mysticism is unknowing, not knowing. Moses goes up into the cloud to have an encounter with God. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew, what it says in that Moses is upset about all the stuff he's been given to do, and he's irritated with God, and he said to God, "Show me your face." And God says, "I'm not going to do that. I'll show you my rear end." That's in the Hebrew. So you know that some of you grew up with this hymn in the church, "He hideth my soul in the cleft of the rock." That is from that text where God took Moses, put him in a crevice of a rock, and said, "You face that way, I will pass by, you can see my backside, but that's it." So Moses goes up into the cloud to have an encounter with God. It's unknowing. It is not knowing. It is never knowing. Jesus goes into the desert alone. Jesus goes up onto the mount in a cloud to experience transfiguration. And one of the most, second one, it's only one of my notes, one of the most important books in Christian mysticism is The Cloud of Unknowing, written by John of the Cross, which is not his name. So let's talk a bit about Jesus, since we're going to be using teachings both by and about him to guide us in the weeks and months ahead. There have been three major periods in theological history in the European English-speaking world, more or less, in devoted to efforts to know about Jesus. Sometime around 1835, a German theologian, biblical scholar by the name of Frederick Strauss stirred up a firestorm when he published a book called The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. That word critically upset a lot of people. How can you be critical of Jesus? And it's much like we would use the phrase applied to somebody who's a movie critic or a theater critic. It's somebody who evaluates based on that. And the reason that Strauss did his work was that there came available at that time more scholarship about how the gospel narratives were written, when they were written, for whom they were written, other questions. And so Strauss undertook trying to answer the question, what can we really know about Jesus? So when I went to seminary, I went with the information that I had been taught in my church about the Bible and about Jesus. For example, I was taught that there was somebody who had hung out with Jesus whose name was Mark, and one day Mark decided to write down Jesus' life, what he said and what he did. As a matter of fact, if you've seen that series depicting the early life of Jesus, what's that? The what? The Chosen. If you've seen The Chosen, you have a scene in it's, by the way, it's very good. It's just not historically accurate, but it's very good. And you have a scene in The Chosen where Matthew is actually helping Jesus write the Sermon on the Mount.
It's not a cover that.
True story. But that's what I was taught. That I was taught. There was a guy named Mark who knew Jesus, and Mark said, I'm going to write this stuff down. Further, I was taught when I began to question some of this, well, you can't question it because God inspired Mark to write it, and therefore there are no errors in it because God inspired Mark. Can't question that. So by the time I got to seminary, I knew what I wanted to do was teach. And I knew that in order to do that, at the time, this is no longer the case, but at the time I went to graduate school, in order to get the credentials to get a doctorate and then to teach, you had to have competency in at least 4 languages: German, French, Hebrew, and Greek. When I went away to school, my mother said, you should take a lot of English. And I said, why? And she said, you need to know a language other than the one you speak. She was an English teacher. So I had started studying Greek in the university, but it wasn't until I got to seminary that I actually bought a Greek New Testament so that I could learn to translate Greek. Indeed, one of the things that a doctoral student in my generation knew was going to happen when you sat for your doctoral defense. Around the table, you sat in a seminar room with a bunch of guys, and at some point, one of them would hand you a Greek New Testament and say, maybe he would open it, always a guy, or you were asked to open it and just read. Translate from the Greek anywhere in the New Testament. And I don't mean to sound inflated. There was a time when I could do that. It has been so pastorally helpful. So when I bought my Greek New Testament and the first gospel we translated was the Gospel of Mark, it was nothing like I imagined would be there. I've shown this slide before, but this is the first page of my Greek New Testament. It's funny to me that the only words in English are Mark, the Gospel of Mark. The rest is Greek. I can't get over there. The top few lines right here, these lines right here, right to here, this is actually the only thing that is in the first page of the Gospel of Mark that is considered the Gospel of Mark. Everything else on that page are footnotes. Now, what those footnotes are variant readings from other Greek manuscripts that they had available at the time, and the people who put together the Greek New Testament that God inspired literally had to pick and choose between all these variant readings, the one that would go in the text above. And this is throughout the New Testament. Page after page after page after page. And new documents are still being discovered. I learned a lot about Mark. I learned, for example, that we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark. It was a name somebody else gave. I learned that the guy who wrote, or the committee who put together Mark, never knew Jesus in the flesh. And this is why seminary professors said, you can't go teach this to your congregations. Because for generations, people had been taught a different version of the story of the Bible. And when you present something different, out you go. At any rate, beginning with Strauss, and through the time of Albert Schweitzer, who wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, we have what's called in scholarship the first quest of the historical Jesus. And Albert Schweitzer, who is a savant of incredible capacity, he ended his book on the quest for the historical Jesus, which is, by the way, quite a moving, emotional, spiritual experience to read about having an encounter with Jesus. He said, what happened was the scholars in the 19th century looked down a well, saw their own reflection, and called it Jesus. That ended the first quest of the historical Jesus. The second quest began about 1950 and was initiated again because of new discoveries that were being made in biblical manuscripts. We just had the Dead Sea Scrolls that had been discovered, and more archaeological things that came out. So that was the beginning of the second quest. A new wave of scholarship was coming out of Europe, particularly Germany, about what this scholarship meant. And one of those most esteemed scholars was a man by the name of Rudolf Bultmann. And Rudolf Bultmann, bless his heart, he had good intentions, I am sure. But instead of calling the works that the New Testament writers created parables, he called them myths. And boy, Christians do not like it when you say anything about their religion is mythic. He should have used the word parable. The third quest has included the work of the West Star Institute, which is still in existence. The Jesus Seminar grew out of the West Star Institute. The Jesus Seminar is no longer in existence. I was intimately connected with that body of work. But at the moment, this is where the best of progressive biblical scholarship comes down. When it comes to the historical details of the life of Jesus, we know very little. Given what information we currently have, scholars say that Jesus was born sometime between 4 and 6 BC. He was probably born in the spring of the year, not on December 25th. He was born in Nazareth, not in Bethlehem. We can conjecture from archaeological data including more recently discovered writings, not biblical writings, but writings that are about the time of Jesus, what the world at that time was like that Jesus grew up in, from forensic DNA. Archaeologists are now able to reconstruct what a typical male at age 33 or 30 might have looked like in that part of the world at that time. None of this data was available years ago, but is now available now. And they don't know what Jesus looked like. This is all conjecture. And what scholars are saying about what we have about Jesus' teachings are gist. You know, a gist. You know, you got the gist of the story. So we have gist. No one knows. So I love the Bultmann stuff. I love what he had to say about a lot of things. We know that Jesus was a Jew living in Nazareth, not highly populated. The nearest really big populated town was Sepphoris. And in Jesus' young adult life in Sepphoris, we know now that there was an execution carried out by Caesar of 2,000 people who were crucified in one fell swoop. Jesus must have known that, must have seen that. People in Nazareth couldn't make a living in Nazareth, so they probably had to go to other places like Sepphoris to work. We do know that Jesus early on had an encounter with a wild man named John the Baptist. We know that Jesus had an itinerant ministry of anywhere between 1 and 3 years. We know that he was executed, considered an enemy of the state, with the support of religious authorities. And we know that out of their experience with him, his followers created a story that is full of kindness and joy and hope and love. What we call the Christmas stories are about a messenger from God who comes into human mystery. He's homeless, not a place to lay his head. He is visited by both low-class and high-class people, shepherds and kings. He is given gifts. The magical qualities in the story told about him touch us because they remind us that at our essence, we are kind, loving, generous human beings. I believe that the loving kindness we feel at Christmas is exactly the kind of energy that Jesus engendered in those who hung out with him. He incarnated wholeness and happiness, and he taught that wholeness and happiness is your birthright. And most importantly, at least for me, Jesus modeled intimacy with God. He prayed all the time. Don't say it, Bill. Just don't. Okay, say it. He clearly had a daily spiritual practice.
Got it.
People around him, not everyone to be sure, but enough, learned and lived love from him. And they also learned and saw that the lessons of love were a threat to the system. They executed him, but that was not the end of the story. There were those who picked up where Jesus left off, and they continued. And a new reality was experienced in their midst, and they called it resurrection. They experienced the birth of Jesus into their lives. I'm speaking metaphorically now. When we are open to the birth of new reality in us, which requires unlearning and unknowing. Now, I know that for many people, these seem to be very dark and uncertain times. If we choose to walk the way, what Meister Eckhart called the wayless way, we're going to have to be the ones who continue the Christian Christmas story by living goodness and goodwill in our everyday, ordinary lives. Right here, right now, we are given a light, a hope, certainty. I made that word up. That loving kindness and truth are our destiny. Whether we embrace that destiny or not is up to us. One of the meanings of the Christmas parables for me is that, like those who created them, we should be able to see that things are hopeless and yet determined to make them otherwise. I'm committed to putting more hope and love in the world than other people can put hate. That's what we're called to do. So spiritual practice, unlearning, unknowing. We'll be returning to these things over and over again as we seek to live out our lives in the light of Jesus. I will close with two things. First, I have a recommendation of something that actually touches in its own way on all three of these roadblocks. Though the spiritual practice is more implied than explicit. And I'm referring to the movie Conclave, which is now streaming on a couple of platforms. If you've not seen this movie, I highly, highly, highly underscore recommend this movie. It's on Prime and it's on Peacock. Thank you. A close friend of mine is a movie reviewer, and he is also spiritually, theologically trained, and he opened my eyes to some of the incredible metaphors that are in this movie. And if you want to, after you see it, I'll be happy to talk to you about them, because I didn't initially see them. I'm going to see the movie again because it's that good. So Conclave, I'm not ruining the movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it. Conclave is set in contemporary time, and the plot line of the movie is that the Pope has died, and a conclave needs to be held at the Vatican in the Sistine Chapel to elect a new Pope. So the movie opens with the Pope's two closest advisors standing by his bedside, and the body of the Pope is in the bed. And they are in grief. They are worried. He was a friend and confidant. And they're worried about the process of choosing a new Pope. And as they stand there, contemplating what has to happen, one comments to the other, this is going to be made more difficult because before he died, he had become a troubled person. About what? Asked one of the priests. He had begun to have doubts. About what? Asked the other, incredulous, as if the Pope was not allowed to have doubts. About God? No, not about God. About the church. The fact of the Pope's doubts about the church is what is played out as the College of Cardinals gathers from all over the world to elect their next leader. The cardinal electors, there are 120 of them, and there are as much political shenanigans going on in the process as a backroom deal cut about gun control or keeping the government running. And you can see groups standing around debating and plotting to see how they're going to get their guy elected to Pope. So again, it's not in any way to ruin the experience of the movie for you to tell you about two scenes that struck me the most powerfully. The first is that the cardinals were holding their private meetings in these little groups, standing around in little groups, so forth. And they were talking about what qualities the Pope should have. And one of them says, over the course of many years, in the service of our Mother the Church, let me tell you, there is one sin I have come to fear above all others: certainty. Certainty is the great enemy of unity. Certainty is the deadly enemy of tolerance. Even Christ was not certain at the end. my God, why have you forsaken me?" He cried out in his agony at the ninth hour on the cross. Our faith is a living thing precisely because it walks hand in hand with doubt. If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery, and therefore no need for faith. Let us pray that God will grant us a pope who doubts. That's powerful, particularly when we live in a world where so many people are so certain about so much. The opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. As I have lived with this truth over the years, what has become more and more apparent to me is that the driving energy of certainty is fear. And this is one of the enormous values of having a daily spiritual practice, is that if you do it, you will encounter the spirit that says, "Fear not." The other scene in that movie that was so powerful to me was one that occurred near the end of the wrangling, the infighting, the posturing, the politicking that went on, leading to the final vote. And it was when one of the cardinals said, "The church is not history. The church is not tradition. The church is what we do next." That's us. It's what we do. We can sit around and be frightened and complain, or we can embrace resurrection and practice patience and tolerance and kindness and love. And by experiencing these things in our own practice, then we're able to take them out and play them as music in the world. I hope you see or stream this movie, and I hope you take it personally, and more, I hope you embrace the gobsmacking end of the movie. It'll set you back on your heels. You know, we don't know when Jesus was born. We don't know the year. We don't know the time. December 25th was not set as a date till sometime early in the 4th century. Scholars diverge about why. Some say it was that December 25th was picked to be in competition with other religions' celebration of the winter solstice, but that's not a settled issue. If that was the case, they missed it by 4 days. If I had a magic wand that worked, I would wave it, and I would cause it to be that people would separate mystery from history. When it comes to Jesus particularly, especially the parables that are told about Jesus. I mentioned last week, we don't do that with any of the other parables. That is, we don't take them as history. We take them as powerful stories. In the parable called the Good Samaritan, we can see ourselves as the man left by the side of the road. We can see ourselves as the Good Samaritan. We can see ourselves as one of the religious people who walk by. We can see ourselves as the innkeeper. Some of us at times can see ourselves as the donkey. I wish we could do that with the Christmas stories. Just take the history out. Just see it as a parable. This story is set in the darkest time of the year because the people who told it lived in darkness, not literally, but metaphorically. They were hopeless. I got these depictions of an unknown artist of the Nativity set in Palestine. And again, these are artistic renditions of the parable. And you got to wonder, where are we in the story? Where are you? A friend of mine from Iraq, actually from Baghdad, had a great difficulty voting in the recent election because he has friends living in Gaza. And so many of the bombs dropped there have made in USA on them. I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty or defensive. We're all in the system. It's what Paul called principalities and powers. But it's the reality. This is the reality that Jesus and his companions lived with. We don't. And yet in that context, after having lived in such brutal conditions for years, they crafted a story of peace on earth, goodwill to men and women. That's amazing. Walking the way means, among other things, dedicating ourselves to that vision. In the 17th century, Christina Rossetti wrote a poem, and later Gustav Holst set it to music. It is my very, very favorite Christmas carol. And it summarizes what I've tried to teach today. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan, earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow and snow, snow and snow, in the bleak midwinter, long, long ago. Our God, heaven cannot hold him, nor earth sustain. Heaven and earth shall flee away when he comes to reign. In the bleak midwinter, a stable sufficed. Lord God Almighty, Jesus Christ. Enough for him whom cherubim worship night and day. Enough for him a breast full of milk, a manger of hay. Enough for him whom angels fall down before. Enough for him the ox and ass and camel which adore. Angels and archangels may have gathered there, cherubim and seraphim throng the air, but only his mother in her maiden bliss worship the beloved with a kiss. Now what can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would give him a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what I can, I give him my heart. Merry Christmas. See you here next year.